The Hudson Valley had always carried a silence that pressed against the skin, a weight that lingered in the air like mist after rainfall. But this silence had changed. It wasn't peace that wrapped around the town of Sleepy Hollow, it was dread. The first killing came in late autumn, when the leaves bled red across the ground and the nights grew longer. A farmer named Elias Granger failed to return from the woods where he gathered firewood. His wife found him at dawn, his body sprawled across the forest path, eyes frozen wide in terror. His head was gone. The second came a week later, a schoolteacher. She was discovered on the riverbank, her blood pooling into the current, her body arranged in some strange, deliberate fashion, as if her killer had staged the scene with ritualistic precision. Her missing head was never found. And then the whispers began. The horseman had returned. The townsfolk shut their doors early, nailed crosses to their barns, and whispered desperate prayers at candlelight. Horses bucked and screamed at the sound of phantom hooves echoing through the midnight fog. Lanterns swayed in empty streets where no one dared walk. The old curse, banished 20 years ago, seemed to have clawed its way back from the grave. But this was different. The victims' bodies bore markings, carved symbols etched into their skin, sigils that twisted like writhing snakes. Those who saw them said it was not the horseman's brutal hand but something far more calculated, as if guided by a purpose darker than vengeance. Far away, in a candlelit study lined with books older than the Republic itself, Ichabod Crane stared down at a letter trembling in his hands. His hair had silvered with age, his face furrowed by the weight of years, but his eyes, sharp, restless, haunted, burned with the same unease he had carried since his first encounter with the horseman. The letter came from Sleepy Hollow's magistrate, scrawled in a hurried hand. There have been killings. Gruesome. Ritualistic. Some say the horseman rides again. The town grows restless, fearful. We need you. Please, Ichabod. Sleepy Hollow needs you once more. He had sworn never to return. After Katrina's passing years ago and the endless nights haunted by dreams of severed heads and galloping hooves, Ichabod had buried himself in a new life, one of study, of forensics, of dissecting the strange and the supernatural in dusty libraries and quiet universities. He became an expert in horrors that most men dared not whisper about. But the name Sleepy Hollow was a wound that never healed. Now the wound was bleeding again. That night, Ichabod stood before his mirror, staring at his weary reflection. He touched the scar along his jaw, a reminder of when steel and shadow nearly claimed him decades before. His hands trembled, not from fear of death, but from fear of what awaited him. Because deep down, he knew. This was no simple haunting. Something older stirred. When he finally arrived in Sleepy Hollow, the town looked both familiar and foreign. Gas lamps flickered along cobbled streets. The church steeple rose against a bruised sky. But the air itself felt wrong, colder, heavier, almost watching. He passed houses where shutters slammed closed at the sight of him, where whispers carried his name as though it were cursed. The villagers remembered him. Some with gratitude, others with fear. He was the man who had faced the horseman. He was also the man who had brought the curse into their stories, making nightmare into truth. At the magistrate's home, Ichabod was greeted by Samuel Van Tassel, a descendant of the family forever entangled with the horseman's legend. Samuel's eyes were bloodshot, his face pale. "They're saying it's him again," Samuel said, voice quivering. "But it's not the same. These killings, they're deliberate. Rituals. It's like someone is trying to summon something worse. Worse than the horseman." Ichabod's voice carried the chill of disbelief. Samuel nodded slowly. "There are rumors, of a book. An old spellbook unearthed from beneath the chapel ruins. They say it belonged to those who first cursed this land." Ichabod's chest tightened. He thought he had faced the worst of Sleepy Hollow, that the headless horseman was the pinnacle of its terror. But as Samuel spoke, as the weight of dread settled into the room, he felt a gnawing truth in his bones. The horseman had been only the beginning. Later, as Ichabod walked back through the fog-draped streets, the night carried with it a sound he had prayed never to hear again. Hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, echoing across the hollow like the drumbeat of doom. Lanterns flickered. The air turned icy, his breath spilling like smoke. Somewhere in the darkness, unseen eyes followed him. The echo of steel struck stone. A neigh cut through the silence like a scream. Ichabod froze. The sound drew closer. And then he saw it. Etched into the dirt of the road, glimmering faintly in the lantern light. A symbol. The same that had been carved into the victims. A circle split by 4 jagged lines. 4 riders. The air grew still, suffocating. The whisper of the valley seemed to crawl into his ears, chilling him to the marrow. He was only the first. The following morning broke gray and lifeless, the mist still strangling the valley like a burial shroud. Sleepy Hollow had always worn fog like a crown, but now it felt suffocating, heavy with an unseen malice. Ichabod Crane awoke in his chamber at the magistrate's house to the tolling of the church bell, 1, 2, 3 strikes too many for the hour. He knew before asking, another death had come. The victim was a miller, dragged from his bed in the night. His head severed with brutal precision, his chest flayed open and carved with strange markings that seemed to twist and shift even in daylight. The townsfolk gathered in grim silence, their eyes darting from the body to Ichabod as though he had been the one to summon such horrors back into their lives. But what struck Ichabod most was the placement of the body. The miller lay upon a stone circle deep in the woods, a place few dared tread. Around him burned the remnants of blackened candles, and etched into the earth was the same sigil Ichabod had seen the night before, 4 jagged lines tearing through a circle. Someone had staged this. Not a ghost, not a rider of vengeance, but hands of flesh and blood. Later that day, Ichabod sought out the town's archives, a dusty crypt beneath the church where records stretched back to the Dutch settlers. It was there he met her, the young historian Samuel had spoken of. Her name was Eliza Ward, a scholar from New York City who had come to study the mythology of Sleepy Hollow for her doctoral work. She had sharp features, dark eyes that burned with skepticism, and a voice that cut through the gloom with biting rationality. "You're Ichabod Crane," she said without preamble. The infamous schoolmaster turned ghost hunter. He bristled slightly at her tone. "I am a man of science. And unfortunately, Sleepy Hollow has little use for skepticism these days. Its dead refuse to stay buried." Eliza smirked faintly but grew serious as she laid out what she had uncovered. These killings, the symbols, they're connected to a society that existed in secret during the colonial days. A sect of settlers who believed in harnessing death as a form of power. They called themselves the Order of the Dread Riders. Ichabod's blood ran cold at the name. Riders. She nodded, sliding forward an aged parchment. Upon it was a crude drawing, 4 faceless figures on horseback, each one bearing a mark of ruin, famine, war, pestilence, and death. Beneath them sprawled a line of scripture in Dutch. "They shall ride when the valley is red, and no man shall stand against them." Ichabod traced the sigil inked beside it. The same 4 jagged lines. Eliza's voice dropped. The headless horseman was only a fragment of their legend. A warning. But if this cult is real, if someone has their spell book, she hesitated, almost afraid to speak the words. Then they're trying to raise all 4. That night, Ichabod and Eliza ventured to the edge of the old Van Tassel estate. Abandoned since the blood-soaked days of the horseman. The mansion loomed like a corpse, its windows hollow eyes, its walls groaning beneath creeping ivy. The Van Tassel bloodline had been forever cursed, and Ichabod felt the weight of it pressing against him with every step. Inside, the air stank of mold and rot. Dust blanketed furniture frozen in time. But in the cellar, they found evidence that chilled Ichabod's marrow, remnants of wax candles, bones arranged in ritualistic patterns, and a torn page that looked ripped from a book far older than any Christian Bible. Its script was in a language Ichabod did not know, jagged and serpentine, but the illustrations left no room for doubt. 4 riders. 4 horrors. Bound to be unleashed upon the living. Eliza's hand trembled as she held the page to the light. "This isn't a ghost story anymore," she whispered. "This is preparation." Before Ichabod could reply, a sound rose from deeper in the cellar. A shuffling, wet and unnatural, like something dragging itself across stone. They froze, lanterns trembling. From the darkness, a figure emerged. It was cloaked, its face hidden beneath a mask fashioned from a hollowed-out skull. In its hands gleamed a knife, slick with blood. Around its neck hung a pendant carved with the rider's sigil. The cult. The figure hissed in a language that slithered against Ichabod's ears like poison. Then more figures appeared, crawling from the shadows, half a dozen of them, masked and chanting, their voices rising in a feverish hymn. Eliza gripped Ichabod's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could flee, the lead figure lifted a dripping sack and appended it across the cellar floor. A severed head rolled toward them, eyes open, lips twisted in a final scream. The chanting grew louder, vibrating through the earth, as if the very valley itself were answering. And in that moment, Ichabod realized the truth. The cult was not just worshipping the horseman. They were preparing a throne for something far worse. Something that was already beginning to wake. The cult's chanting clawed at Ichabod's nerves like nails on stone. The severed head at his feet stared with glassy eyes, its mouth frozen in a silent wail. Eliza's grip on his arm tightened until her nails cut through fabric. The cellar walls pulsed with shadows as the masked figures swayed, their voices rising in a fever pitch that seemed to split the very air. "Run," Ichabod whispered. They bolted toward the stairwell, lanterns swinging wildly. Behind them came the clatter of boots and the echo of snarling words. The cultists pursued, their skull masks gleaming in the flicker of candlelight. Ichabod slammed the cellar door shut, wedging an iron bar through the latch. The wood groaned against the pounding fists beneath. For a moment, silence. Then a single voice rose from below, guttural and commanding. "The riders wake. The hollow shall bleed again." Eliza's face was pale, her breath ragged. "They won't stop." "No," Ichabod admitted. "They won't. Not until they've finished what they've begun." That night, Ichabod led Eliza back to the magistrate's house, where Samuel Van Tassel waited, pacing like a man haunted by unseen eyes. He listened in horror as they described the cellar, the chanting, the pendant. His face drained when Ichabod mentioned the torn page. "The riders," Samuel muttered. "My grandfather spoke of them. He said the horseman was only a herald, a fragment of something far older. The curse runs in the blood of this valley, Crane. And in mine." At Ichabod's urging, Samuel brought them to the Van Tassel family vault beneath the chapel. The crypt smelled of damp stone and age-old secrets. Carved into the walls were murals, worn by centuries but still clear enough to tell their story. By lantern light, Ichabod traced the first mural, Dutch settlers arriving in the valley, their faces marked with fear. They came here fleeing war, famine, pestilence, yet those curses followed them. The second mural was worse. Foreshadowed riders loomed over the valley, each more grotesque than the last. One bore a sword dripping with black fire. Another carried scales weighted with skulls. The third was crowned with thorns of rot, his flesh rotting from bone. And the fourth, tall, faceless, cloaked in darkness, rode a steed of smoke and flame. "The 4 riders of the dread," Eliza murmured. "War. Famine. Pestilence. Death." The final mural showed the settlers kneeling in desperation. A circle was drawn, runes etched into the soil. At its center was a sacrifice, a man, head severed, blood spilling into the earth. The horseman, Ichabod said softly. Samuel's voice trembled. He was never the curse itself. He was bound. A guard dog set loose by the settler's ritual, meant to keep the riders at bay. But his thirst for vengeance consumed him, until he became the very legend you faced. The revelation sank like lead in Ichabod's chest. The horseman had not been the source of the valley's evil. He had been its chain. And now that chain had been broken. Eliza turned to Samuel, her voice low but steady. If the cult has found the book, then they're trying to finish what the settlers started. Not bind the riders, summon them. The crypt seemed to breathe around them, the shadows stretching long against the stone. That night, Ichabod could not sleep. He sat at his desk, the torn page from the cult's lair spread before him. His mind churned with images of the murals, the chanting, the severed head. He dipped his quill and began to sketch, retracing the sigils, matching them to symbols he had studied in his years of supernatural forensics. Every line whispered danger. Every curve reeked of blood. And at the center, always, were the riders. A sound broke his concentration, the soft creak of the window. He turned sharply. For a moment, nothing but the fog pressing against the glass. Then, faintly, a figure emerged in the mist. A girl. She stood barefoot on the cobblestones, her dress white and damp with dew, her hair tangled like weeds. Her eyes, pale, almost glowing, were locked on his. Ichabod pushed the window open. "Who are you?" Her voice was little more than a breath. "I see them." His skin prickled. "The cult?" She shook her head slowly. "The dead. They whisper. They ride again." Before Ichabod could question her further, she vanished into the fog, swallowed whole as if she had never existed. When he told Eliza the next morning, she frowned. "A hallucination?" "No," Ichabod said firmly. "A harbinger." The valley was stirring. The horseman had been but a shadow of what now threatened to awaken. As dawn crept across the hills, a riderless horse was found wandering the village square, its saddle soaked in fresh blood. Inside the saddlebag lay another head. Carved into its forehead was the same sigil. 4 jagged lines. And beneath it, in blood, a message. "The hollow belongs to us." The discovery of the blood-soaked horse sent a shudder through Sleepy Hollow. By midday, whispers slithered through every tavern, every market, every church pew. Some claimed the horseman was hunting again. Others swore the devil himself had risen to claim the town. Mothers clutched their children closer. Doors slammed shut before sunset. But Ichabod Crane knew the truth was far more dangerous than either rumor. The sigil carved into the victim's brow was no mere token of vengeance, it was a calling card, a declaration that the cult's work was only beginning. And then there was the girl. He found her again 2 nights later, standing on the edge of the graveyard as if she had been waiting for him. The fog curled around her ankles, pale and ghostly in the moonlight. She looked no older than 14, though her eyes bore the weight of centuries. "You returned," Ichabod said, approaching with cautious steps. "They won't leave me alone," she whispered, her voice fragile as falling ash. "The dead. They follow me. They scream when the riders stir." Ichabod felt a chill lance his spine. "What is your name, child?" "Lydia." Eliza had insisted on accompanying him. She stepped forward, skeptical as always. "If you see the dead, Lydia, prove it." "What do you see now?" The girl lifted her gaze toward the rows of leaning gravestones. Her lips parted, trembling. "They're everywhere. Some walk without heads. Some burn. Some are bones gnawed by worms, still begging for release. They whisper your names." Ichabod's breath caught. "Ours?" Lydia nodded. "Yours, and hers. They say you'll stand where the horseman fell. That you'll bleed where he bled. Eliza paled despite herself. Convenient prophecy. But before Ichabod could respond, Lydia's body stiffened. Her eyes rolled white, her voice no longer her own. They are coming. The wind howled through the graveyard, snuffing out the lantern. From the darkness, whispers rose. Not human, but guttural, wet, like the echo of corpses speaking beneath the soil. Shapes stirred between the gravestones, figures half-formed, caught between flesh and shadow. Eliza stumbled back, her rationality shattering as skeletal hands clawed from the dirt, dragging rotted torsos behind them. The dead were rising. Ichabod grabbed Lydia, shaking her. How do we stop them? Her eyes snapped back to focus, and she collapsed into his arms. You can't, she rasped. Not while the riders stir. They hunger for vessels. They will wear the dead until they find the living. The first corpse lunged, jaw unhinged, its skull half-caved but its limbs strong with unnatural strength. Ichabod swung his lantern, the flame catching dry cloth, and the creature shrieked as fire consumed it. Yet 3 more rose in its place, clawing toward them with grasping hands. Run! Eliza cried, pulling Ichabod and Lydia toward the church. The bell tower loomed against the night, its shadow long and jagged. They crashed through the doors just as the dead reached the threshold, hissing and writhing like beasts denied their prey. Inside, the sanctuary smelled of wax and mildew. Ichabod barred the doors with a pew while Eliza struck flint to light the altar candles. Their glow cast monstrous shapes on the walls, shadows that seemed to shift even when the flames stood still. Lydia stirred, her small voice cutting through the tension. The cult feeds them. Every head taken, every body marked, it opens the way wider. The riders aren't here yet, but their shadows are. The horseman was their herald. Now the herald is gone. They want new vessels. Ichabod's voice shook despite his effort to steady it. And you can see them? She nodded weakly. Always. They won't stop until the hollow is theirs. The doors shuddered beneath heavy blows. The dead were battering against them, groaning with voices that dripped like rotting wood. Splinters rained across the floor. Eliza clutched a candleholder like a weapon. Crane, she hissed, we can't hold this place. He looked down at Lydia, her face pale as wax. Tell me how to banish them. Her eyes glistened with tears. You can't. Not yet. You can only flee. The pew cracked. A skeletal arm burst through the wood, fingers grasping for flesh. The smell of earth and decay filled the church. Ichabod seized Eliza's wrist. The crypts, this way. They fled down a narrow staircase, Lydia limp in his arms. The dead howled as the doors finally gave way, flooding the sanctuary with clawing shadows. But Ichabod and Eliza disappeared into the catacombs below, swallowed by darkness. The air was damp, heavy with the stench of ancient bones. Flickering candlelight illuminated rows of skulls, empty sockets watching their every step. Somewhere above, the church bell tolled again, though no hand rang it. The sound rolled through the stone like thunder. And in the stillness of the crypt, Lydia's voice came soft but certain, as if she had been waiting to say it. The first rider is awake. The crypt pressed in around them, damp stone walls weeping moisture like open wounds. Lydia's words echoed in Ichabod's skull, the first rider is awake. Eliza's face was pale, lit only by the trembling candle in her hand. What does she mean? Awake how? Ichabod didn't answer. He didn't need to. He felt it already, a pressure in the air, a low thrum like a war drum buried beneath the earth. Each beat rattled his bones. Each vibration was heavier than the last. Something vast and ancient was stirring, and they were trapped beneath it. The air grew foul, a stench of rust and rot. The skulls lining the walls rattled in their niches. Dust rained from the ceiling. Then came the sound, hooves. Not galloping, but deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of centuries. Eliza's candle sputtered, then died. Darkness swallowed them whole. Lydia stirred in Ichabod's arms. Her lips parted, but the voice that spilled out was not her own. It was deep, guttural, and layered, as though dozens spoke through her at once. War rides. A thunderous crack split the crypt. Red light flared, searing the darkness. At the far end of the corridor, a figure emerged. It sat astride a horse black as pitch, its mane a writhing curtain of smoke. The rider itself was armored, its body forged from rusted iron plates fused to pale, scarred flesh. Its helm was a hollow mask with no eyes, only a jagged mouth that gaped open like a wound. In its hands it bore a blade longer than any man, dripping with black fire that hissed where it touched the ground. The first rider, War. Eliza staggered back, choking on terror. God preserve us. The rider raised its blade, and the very walls trembled. A wave of sound tore through the crypt, not words, but a scream of battle, of thousands of voices crying out in agony. The skulls shattered, spraying bone shards across the floor. Ichabod shielded Lydia with his coat, his heart pounding against her frail body. This was no specter of vengeance like the horseman. This was a force of annihilation, older than scripture, older than legend. The rider's horse pawed the ground, each strike sparking embers. Then the rider swung. The sword struck stone. The floor split wide, vomiting fire and ash. The crypt filled with screams, echoes of soldiers long dead, their voices chained to the blade. Shapes writhed in the fire, mangled bodies locked in endless combat, hands clawing for release. Eliza screamed. We can't fight this. Ichabod grabbed her arm, dragging her into a side passage as stone rained from the ceiling. The rider turned its faceless helm toward them, and though it had no eyes, Ichabod felt its gaze burn into his marrow. They stumbled through the twisting catacombs, the horse's hooves shaking the ground behind them. Each step the rider took seemed to fold space itself, closing the distance no matter how far they ran. Lydia opened her eyes suddenly, her voice sharp with urgency. The chapel. Get me to the chapel ruins. Ichabod didn't question her. He had learned long ago that those who bore the sight walked closer to truth than reason ever could. He sprinted, lungs burning, until the catacombs split upward toward a crumbling staircase. Eliza clutched his coat, half dragged as they climbed into the night. The rider burst from the stairwell behind them, shattering stone as easily as bone. It emerged into the graveyard, horse blazing, sword raised high. The dead writhed in their graves, clawing at their coffins, eager to serve their master. Ichabod fell to his knees before the shattered chapel altar, gasping for breath. What now, girl? Lydia crawled forward, her hands trembling as she traced a symbol into the cracked stone, an inverted circle, slashed with jagged lines. It won't banish him. But it will bind him. Only for a time. The rider's sword crashed against the earth, sending shockwaves that toppled gravestones. Eliza dropped to her knees beside Lydia, pressing her palm against the carved symbol. What do I do? Blood, Lydia whispered. It needs blood. Without hesitation, Eliza drew a knife from her boot and slashed her palm. Her blood spattered across the stone, seeping into the lines. The symbol flared with light, searing against the darkness. The rider reared, its horse shrieking, a sound like tearing metal. Its blade swung, but stopped, caught mid-strike by unseen chains of fire that coiled from the glowing symbol. The rider writhed, bound in place, its form flickering like a shadow resisting the dawn. Ichabod pulled Lydia back as the rider let out one final, deafening roar. The chains tightened, dragging it downward. Horse and rider sank into the earth, swallowed by fire and stone until only silence remained. The graveyard lay still. The night air was heavy, but the hooves were gone. Eliza slumped against the altar, clutching her bleeding hand. Did we kill it? Lydia shook her head slowly. Her eyes glistened with tears. No. We only slowed it. And 3 more are coming. The toll of the church bell rang out again, deep and hollow, though the tower stood empty. Each strike was a warning. Each strike called another rider awake. The Hudson Valley had never known such silence. After the first rider's appearance, the town withdrew into itself like a creature hiding from a predator. Doors were bolted, shutters nailed shut, and prayers muttered in the trembling dark. But silence is never safety, not in Sleepy Hollow. In the woods, where the trees nodded together to blot out the stars, the cult gathered. Dozens of them, cloaked in black and masked with bone. Their circle blazed with firelight, each torch dripping wax like flesh melting from bone. At its center, carved into the soil, was the same sigil, for jagged lines tearing through a circle, only now it was swollen, expanded, its grooves filled with blood. A body lay across the symbol, bound with iron chains, its chest rising and falling in shallow terror. The miller's wife, the latest to be taken. She screamed against the gag in her mouth, but the chanting drowned her cries. The leader of the cult stepped forward, his mask fashioned from the skull of a stag, antlers sprawling into the night sky. His voice carried like thunder. The first has risen, as promised. War has tasted earth once more. Now the second must ride, Famine, the devourer, the witherer of flesh. He raised a blade carved from blackened bone. The firelight made it glisten as though slick with fresh gore. The chanting swelled, guttural and relentless, rising in waves that made the ground itself tremble. Symbols burned into the soil, glowing with a sickly green light. Birds shrieked and fell dead from the trees. The bound woman's body convulsed as if some unseen hand were already tearing through her. With one brutal stroke, the cult leader plunged the knife into her chest. Blood erupted, spilling across the symbol, feeding the earth. The woman's scream cut short, replaced by a sound not her own, a deep, endless moan that shook the forest like a storm. The flames surrounding the circle darkened, shifting from orange to black. Shadows bent unnaturally, stretching long like claws. The soil swelled, cracking, as if something beneath it clawed upward. From the broken earth, a hand emerged, skeletal, flesh hanging in tatters, fingers like knives. Then another. Slowly, a figure pulled itself free, dragging a body so wasted it looked carved from bone. Its ribs jutted sharp, its skin gray and shriveled. Its face was a hollow mask of hunger, jaw unhinged, mouth filled with rows of needle teeth. The second rider, Famine. Its horse followed, rising from the soil in pieces, its skeleton reassembling as worms of black smoke slithered through its ribs. When it finally stood, it was little more than bone and sinew, yet it breathed, its empty eye sockets dripping black ichor. The rider mounted, a grotesque king of ruin. With a shriek that split the night, it raised a set of scales in one skeletal hand. The weight swung violently, spilling maggots and ash. The cult fell to their knees, bowing as if before a god. Famine rides, the leader roared. The hollow shall wither. Flesh shall fail. Blood shall dry. As the rider lifted its head, the trees surrounding the circle began to rot. Leaves curled inward, blackened, and fell. Bark cracked and peeled, dripping foul sap. Insects scattered from their burrows only to collapse, twitching, their shells hollowing to dust. And beyond the woods, the curse spread. Crops in the valley's fields wilted in moments. Horses staggered in their stalls, ribs protruding as if starved overnight. Milk soured in its pail, bread turned to mold. Hunger crept like a plague. Miles away, in the magistrate's house, Ichabod felt it. He woke in a cold sweat, his throat dry as dust, his stomach twisting with sudden emptiness. Eliza sat upright in her chair, her face drained of color. "It's begun," she whispered. Lydia sat in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest, rocking gently. Her voice was faint, cracked. "Famine is awake. He brings hollow mouths, endless hunger. The valley will starve. And death will walk in its place. Ichabod buried his face in his hands. The first rider had nearly destroyed them in a single night. Now another rode, and with each head taken, each ritual completed, the world tilted further into shadow. What do we do? Eliza demanded, desperation in her tone. How do you fight hunger itself? Lydia's pale eyes lifted, gleaming in the candlelight. You don't. You endure. Until the last rider comes. And then you die. The words fell like a death sentence, heavy and absolute. Outside, the church bell tolled again. But this time, it didn't stop at one strike. It rang 12 times, each peal echoing through the valley like the heartbeat of something ancient and awake. And somewhere in the night, beneath the trees where the cult bowed in ecstasy, the second rider turned its eyeless gaze toward Sleepy Hollow. It was hungry. And it would never be full. The night bled into Sleepy Hollow with no dawn. A sky of bruised purple pressed low over the valley, clouds shifting like restless spirits. No bird sang. No wind stirred. The world held its breath, waiting. Ichabod Crane stood in the cemetery at the edge of town, lantern in one hand, sword in the other. He was older now, shoulders slumped with age, yet his eyes burned with the same haunted resolve as when he first faced the horseman. Only this time, he knew the foe was not a single rider, but an army of nightmares. Beside him, Eliza clutched her satchel of notes and relics, her hands shaking despite her resolve. And Lydia, pale as moonlight, stood barefoot in the grass, her white dress torn and smeared with earth. She had stopped speaking hours ago, but her eyes, those hollow, haunted eyes, stared at the distant tree-line where firelight flickered. The cult had gathered. Tonight was their culmination. Ichabod's voice was low, urgent. If they summon the third rider, death will sweep this place clean of life. And if the fourth comes, the world itself will end. Eliza looked at him, her face etched with fear. Then we must stop them before the ritual begins. But Lydia finally spoke, her voice fragile, brittle as glass. It has already begun. Can't you hear them? The earth is crying. The sky is bleeding. They are coming. And she was right. From the forest rose the sound of drums, not human drums, but thunderous, bone-deep pounding, as though the ground itself was a heartbeat. Shadows twisted in the torchlight of the cult's circle. Dozens of cloaked figures chanted, their voices layering into a hideous harmony that scraped the soul raw. Ichabod, Eliza, and Lydia crept closer, hiding among the gravestones, until the entire circle came into view. The cult stood around a massive stone altar, carved with ancient sigils that pulsed with green fire. Upon it lay another victim, throat already cut, blood running into the grooves. The leader, the stag-masked prophet, raised his arms, voice booming. War rides. Famine rides. Tonight we summon pestilence, the rotting breath of decay. The ground quaked. A stench filled the air, sweet, rancid, like corpses left in the summer sun. From the altar rose a cloud of writhing insects, millions of them, spilling into the trees, crawling over the cultists, burrowing into the soil. And then, from the shadows, came the third rider. Its body was swollen, blackened with boils. Its horse dripped pus from every pore, eyes leaking yellow ichor. Around its neck hung ropes of entrails, swarming with flies. Wherever it stepped, grass blackened and flesh blistered. The cult fell prostrate. Pestilence! Pestilence! Ichabod knew they were running out of time. He drew his blade, heart pounding, whispering to Eliza, "Stay behind me. Whatever happens, do not let them draw blood from you." But it was Lydia who stepped forward first. Her voice cut the air like a knife. "You fools," she cried, her small body trembling as if consumed by unseen hands. "You don't summon riders, they summon you. You are nothing but fuel. They will devour you, and then the world." The cult turned, their masked faces snapping toward her, hissing like serpents. The leader raised his bone knife. Seize the seer. The cult lunged, but Ichabod moved, blade flashing. The first attacker fell with his throat cut, spraying the altar in more blood. Eliza swung her lantern, flames licking the night as cloth caught fire. Screams rose as cultists burned. Yet their resistance was like striking water, endless waves of robed bodies surged forward. The riders stirred at the chaos. War's blade gleamed crimson, famine's scales rattled with hunger, pestilence loosed a plague of locusts into the sky. And beyond them, in the trembling air, a fourth shadow began to stir, a towering figure cloaked in endless black. The final rider. Death. Lydia's eyes rolled back as she screamed, her voice layered with something inhuman. He comes. The last shadow. When death rides, the world ends. Ichabod grabbed her, shaking her violently. Lydia. If you see, tell me, how do we stop them? Her gaze snapped back, wild with terror. You don't stop them. You bury them. Bury their names, their blood, their fire. You must give them back to the grave. The cult leader lunged for her, blade raised, but Eliza tackled him, her hand driving a crucifix into his chest. He shrieked, collapsing, as fire exploded from the altar. The ritual faltered. The riders screamed, horrible, bone-splitting sounds, each cry shaking the world. Shadows writhed, fire bled green, the altar cracked in two. For a moment, the veil between worlds flickered, and then, with a sound like the earth tearing open, the riders vanished into smoke. Silence fell. Ichabod collapsed to his knees, blade slick with blood, lungs heaving. Eliza stumbled to his side, eyes wide with disbelief. Did we stop it? But Lydia did not answer. She stood at the altar, staring into the smoke, whispering to something no one else could see. Ichabod's blood froze as he caught her words. Yes. I know. You will come again. This was only a taste. The world will be yours soon enough. Her voice was not her own. When she turned, her eyes were black. The riders were not gone. They had only found a new vessel. And Sleepy Hollow would never sleep again.